Gattuso. We are here this week with Esther Thorpe. She is a media analyst, co-founder of the Media Voices podcast, and the editor of the Media Roundup newsletter. Thank you for joining us today, Esther. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you for having me.
I am so excited to talk with Esther about Media Roundup as a part of an ecosystem of media content that they're putting out, and especially because she is analyzing other media. So it's like a really unique situation you're in, right? As a, like, not necessarily a journalist, but you are with your own media analyzing the state of media, which y'all just put out a annual report, right?
Yeah, we've just done an annual report. Newsletters doesn't get a big mention in that, but it's there's a lot of pressure, I think, to put into place a lot of the business models that we study. So we sort of study and we talk about which models are working well for people, but then you have to kind of try and also look at your own and be like, right, what's going to work for us? We talk about things like audience engagement a lot, and it's like, well, how are we doing that ourselves? So it can be quite challenging sometimes, but also really interesting because we get to study so many different types of models and so many different types of business. So yeah, especially this year, it's been particularly interesting.
Yeah, so you're eating and breathing what's going on in publishing and publishing about it. What were some of the big trends? We will put links in the description below. This is on YouTube, so anyone can go find the description and find some links. So I'll put a link, I think we linked last week in Opt-in Weekly, to the report, or I forget, was it called a report or was it called something fancier than that?
It was called Media Moments, but it is a report, yes.
Yes, okay. So what were some of the big trends of 2020?
Oh gosh. COVID aside, I think it was more how COVID impacted everything. There were subscriptions was obviously a massive trend, and that wasn't just print subscriptions or digital subscriptions. It's this idea that people are finally kind of okay with paying for a news outlet or paying for content that isn't Netflix or Spotify. Those have been quite well established for a number of years, but yeah, people are now getting to the stage where they're like, oh, actually, I'll take out a Washington Post or Atlantic subscription, or I'll support a writer, and that's been really encouraging to see, especially as when COVID hit, that actually accelerated, and we were there for a moment in March, like, are people going to cancel because they're under loads of financial pressure? Or are they actually going to suddenly decide that they're going to support these organizations? And they fortunately went the latter way. So that was really, really encouraging. And I think that's been one of the biggest drivers this year.
Yeah, it's interesting to see this conflict play out as we are in a more mature phase of social media and internet publishing, and watching the big tech companies engage with, but yet compete with, independent publishers or publishing groups. So what do you imagine we're going to see in the next couple of years in terms of some of the legislation that's happening and some of the partnerships that companies like Google are trying to make with news publishers?
Yeah, that's I wrote the chapter on platforms this year, and I had to try and condense all of this into 1,200 words.
That can happen.
But I think the next few years are going to look very, very different for the tech platforms, because if legislation doesn't affect them, I think you're going to end up with if US legislation doesn't affect them, you're going to end up with countries like Australia, where Facebook has said, okay, fine, we'll just switch off. France is kind of in a similar situation where Google and Facebook have both issued threats to split or to restrict content. And it's I think Casey Newton described it as the splinternet. So even if legislation doesn't force the splinter, well, other governments will. And I think that'll be really interesting. So if Facebook isn't forced to give up Instagram and WhatsApp in what is going to be a very lengthy legal battle anyway, I think we could see that tension between news publishers and wanting them to pay for content and trying to sort out that bit of the ecosystem that's broken, coming into big conflict with governments that are kind of putting this legislation in place, but they don't really, very few digital laws are actually suitable for the 21st century. And you've got, with all due respect to them, people that don't understand the internet trying to create these laws. So agreed. I think it's going to be really interesting for years, but it's difficult to say how how well that's going to turn out for publishers. I was reading a piece literally just yesterday where somebody at News Corp was like, oh, that's going to be great because we get loads of money in licensing fees. And it's like, that's only a short-term deal. You know, 3 years down the line, if Google's embroiled in all sorts of rows elsewhere, it'll just switch that money off.
Right. There's a sense of, I think, anxiety when some other entity can control whether or not your income stream continues to flow.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it is very much that thing that we've been so reliant and so dependent on the platforms for such a long time that we're still as an industry trying to kind of look towards that model of, no, well, we want to take that relationship back. We want to have that relationship with the reader ourselves. And that's not to say that, I mean, that's where newsletters have grown in popularity, because it is that direct connection, but that's then not to say that can't also be affected.
Right. Okay. So Media Roundup is a curated newsletter that links to content that your team has created, as well as news from other publishers about like the state of media, what's going on. It's a daily newsletter that I'd love for you to explain the history of a little bit, because I know that when I first found out about your newsletter, I think it had recently switched to daily. So what's like the backstory on Media Roundup? Yeah,
so we actually, as a podcast, we put out a weekly podcast, and we've kind of always had a newsletter with that, just because it's something you do, and, you know, it reminds people that your episode's there. But it got to the stage we've been doing this for about 3 years, and we'd had this weekly newsletter. And in that newsletter, we put the episode we'd just put out, we put all the links to things we'd discussed, you know, maybe some other stuff we were doing. And then at the bottom, we'd have a little section on stuff we'd written around the industry. And, you know, it did all right. It kind of had maybe 20-30% open rates, but we found that people weren't clicking on the episode itself. They were going to the bottom and they were clicking on what we'd written. And again, like, you know, weekly, it wasn't really enough to set habit. People weren't kind of sharing it, or, you know, our list was growing really, really slowly. And we kind of got to the stage where we were like, well, what's the point? Why are we putting this out each week? You know, what's our mission at Media Voices, and how does the newsletter fit into that? And our mission essentially is to help publishing and media professionals with their jobs, stay up to date with the industry. And we thought, well, we're not really doing that. By the time our newsletter's gone out, all the stuff we discussed in the podcast is last week's news. But then, you know, I mean, a daily newsletter is a big commitment to put out. So it was when I actually ended up leaving. I left my job.
Okay.
So I'm now sort of freelance, and I do Media Voices alongside other stuff. Yeah, and we just kind of had a think about what we wanted to do, and we said, well, actually, one of the biggest issues for media professionals is that they're really, really busy people. There are loads and loads of media newsletters. You can get Neiman Lab, American Press Institute, like there's a list of all the ones you can get to keep you up to date. But they're all really long. So, you know, if you want to stay up to date, you're there having to scroll through 15 newsletters in the morning, and that doesn't help.
No.
So we thought, well, what we'll do that bit of the work, because we do that bit of the work anyway for the podcast. And we'll distill that into just 4 stories that we think you need to know each day.
Okay.
So that might be across, you know, that might be magazine subscriptions, that might be what Facebook's got up to with Australia, that might be sort of, you know, ad legislation, but we'll distill that into just 4 stories you need to know. And then that's a proposition. That's then a newsletter that people will be happy to receive daily, that doesn't take up too much time. You know, you can read it in 2 minutes.
So is it daily, Monday through Friday?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And we do have a Saturday edition, but that's a slightly different thing. I can talk about that later.
Oh, yeah. That one's special.
Yeah. But yeah, so we do the 4 top stories. We put the podcast just in at the bottom every day. And then there's just a slot that we have at the very bottom for stuff that we might be doing or other things we want to promote.
Has that putting that podcast in at the bottom daily increased listening? Okay.
It has. And what we actually find is that I expected by sort of Thursday or Friday, people who got the newsletter on Monday wouldn't want to click on the podcast anymore. But actually, the clicks remain steady throughout the week. So you've got people that on a Thursday might not have had time to listen on Monday, and they then get that reminder in their inbox that, oh, actually, this episode is here. I'll listen to it now. But yeah, it's so the 4 stories we choose, sometimes we write them, sometimes more often than not they're from around the rest of the industry. But what we do is we have a top story where we actually just do, it's about 150 words of analysis on it. And that's just for our newsletter subscribers. And that just says, this is why we think this is the most important thing for you today. And then here are sort of 3 other stories that, if you're interested, will.
Okay.
Good.
I'm going to interrupt us for a second and suggest, like, if you want to start your screen share and show people what that looks like, if that's what you've got prepped and ready. I love to look at people's newsletters and kind of ask them how they made the decisions they made based on the things that you repeat and the things that you stagger.
Can you see that?
I can.
Good. In which case, I'll show you the one we did from Friday, just because I've got one I'm editing, but I've only put one story in it so far.
I hear
This is our media roundup. So I'm one of 3 people that write this. So we always start the day by saying who's bringing it to you, because Chris, Peter, and I all have slightly different slants on things. So it's quite good for whoever's receiving the email to see whose slant it is that morning.
Sure.
So yeah, on Friday we had the news that the correspondent was shutting down, and that news would have been everywhere. Most newsletters carried that as their top story. So we sort of said, well, what can we bring to this story, rather than just being like, oh, it's shutting down. So this is just the analysis we did of it as our top story, where we just said, perhaps the article we've linked to, this is some of the flaws in their argument. This is some of the reasons we think that this might have shut down. So that's that top story. So
that's like your top story, and then you have 3 that are stacked that are like less content, but equally like cool to go read. And
I mean these vary from, there's something about an ad spend initiative there. You've got Google and Facebook and the latest on the digital news law, and then there's a bit about the Athletic subscriber growth strategy. So the idea is that it's a mix for all sorts of levels, all sorts of people. If you only find one thing interesting that day, that's fine. You've not had to scroll through 15 things to try and find it. It's very much like, it's curation in an extreme almost, where we just say, right, we're just going to try and bring the top 4 things.
Is that part of the challenge? I guess, okay, I'm thinking through your process. You've got multiple people on a team responsible for different days of the week.
Yeah.
And you have headlines coming in that you're collecting into your software so that everyone sees what's in there, right? So I'm assuming you're all just gathering it as you see it come into your inbox.
I can show you, actually. We have
a pocket.
We have a pocket. So we all have the same login for this, and this is just literally, if we see something interesting, we'll just save it it's just a bucket of articles essentially. So there's a couple of things I've saved in there today. There's a couple of things the other 2 have saved. So when we come to do the newsletter at the end of the day, we'll have a look in here and say, oh, okay, what people put in, what's particularly interesting. So it does end up being balanced day to day, but it just might be that top story is something that one of us feels particularly passionate about in some way.
Okay. And so do you start working on the next day's newsletter a few days in advance? Like, do you claim stories and get them into your system, or how does that work?
No, because we do it daily, we literally just look at that day's news. It's probably about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We'll then look and start putting it together, or we might put it together throughout the day if we spot something particularly interesting that we've got thoughts on. But in general, we don't leave news to other people just because it does move quite quickly.
All right. So you're trying to keep up with the pace of what you want to deliver the next day versus like, oh, I'll take this, you'll take this. I like that. So then do you sync that from Pocket to your ESP and have it waiting in there, or do you just use like an extension and grab it?
It all syncs up. So when we're then composing, we can just see all those articles.
Great. So it's there like in the hopper waiting for you to put in. And then you have repeated items, which are that week's podcasts at the bottom.
So these are our 2 slots. So we've always got the week's podcast, and that just stays in for the whole week. And then this bottom little slot, Friday it happened to be just advertising our Ko-Fi coffee. We argue about how to pronounce it, but that's just our little sort of donation if you want to buy us a coffee. I think I can show you the one I'm doing today. So today we've decided to do a promotion for the Media Moments report. Okay. And that's just a way of being like, well, this is what we're doing. You know, we don't have to use that slot. If we do, great. If not,
right. It's there waiting.
Yeah, exactly. But we try not to go above 2 there, because we don't want it to, we don't want the proportions of the newsletter to be too self-promotional.
Yeah. So that's what I was going to ask, is how important do you feel like it is? And like, I obviously have an opinion, and I'm trying not to ask this in a way that like you'd ask a kid who you want to answer the way you want them to answer. But how important do you think it is to like deliver that valuable content up top, and then the thing you want them to do, which is also go listen to valuable content in your case, or go download this report, in that order?
I think because of the size of the newsletter, we don't find the ordering has too much of an impact. It definitely did when we did the weekly newsletter, because that was quite long. But I think with this, we know that we know from the click rates that quite a few people do actually scroll down to the bottom, because you can read the whole thing in 2 minutes. So in that sense, we're not stressing too much that, oh, this is a really great podcast episode, but it's down the bottom, because we know that that's where people expect it. That's where people find it, and they don't get halfway down and think, oh, flipping it, there are still 20 stories to go. I can't bother to read all the way down.
Right.
So in that sense, I'd say in normal newsletters, the ordering matters quite a lot, but because of the way we've structured this one, it doesn't affect us too much.
So when you transitioned from weekly to daily, what was like, that's a difference in the workload, right? Like that's distributing things differently. What was that process like, making that like change in what you were doing?
I think because 3 of us do it, it actually wasn't too bad. We that was our biggest concern with going daily, is, well, the 3 of us do have lives, and this is an extra thing we're taking on. But because we then set up the workflow beforehand with pooling the articles, and then most newsletter editors are drag and drop with this sort of thing, whereas so we were using MailChimp beforehand, and that was very much, you have to upload an image, you have to put the headline in, link the headline. Whereas these sort of editorial focused newsletter tools are very much like, you drop the URL in and it pulls it all in for you.
Right.
So that cuts a lot of time off the editing process. And again, because it was that focus on, well, we're going from a really long newsletter to a really short daily one, usually it doesn't take us more than sort of 15-20 minutes to put together. And we then cycle around that between the 3 of us. So I might do 1 or 2 newsletters a week, and that's then not too heavy a burden. So in terms of workflow, we definitely had to sort out the workflow before we could launch it, but it hasn't been half as bad as we thought it would be in terms of workload.
Okay, and then the results of that, have you seen subscriptions or engagement grow, like in relation to that shift?
So we actually took the decision, because we were moving from a weekly to a daily, not to automatically bring everybody over. Because the newsletters are so different, we thought actually we're going to get quite a bit of backlash if people are expecting a weekly and we suddenly start hammering them with a daily. So we did a nurture series to our old audience, just to say, look, we're looking at launching a daily. We know that this is a big commitment, but if you want to sample it, here are some samples, things like that. And we managed to transition. It was about half our audience in the end, which was more than I expected, probably less than I hoped.
Right.
But the ones that did transition are really, really engaged. So with, I think I said our open rates for the weekly were about 20, 25, 30% on a good day. Whereas now they rarely dip below 40%. And we're looking 40 to 55% for most of our daily newsletters now.
Nice.
And it really helps with growth, because people are quite clear what they're getting and when. And it's not just, oh, this is a weekly newsletter with some links from last week. It's very much like, we have a clear proposition.
Do you have, I'm sure that people are curious about like the monetization goals. A lot of people that I talk to who have editorial newsletters kind of started as a side thing, and their first goal is just to figure out what they want to produce, what their audience wants, and if there is like if it's going to jive, right? Like, can they build an audience? And like I was talking with Wade from Apps Weekly like a week or two ago, and he's like completely chill with, this is not how I'm like making money right now. This is how I will grow an audience and make money in the future. So if you have a podcast and a newsletter, are there sponsorship opportunities? We know we can like help buy you coffee, but but is this like, is there a trajectory, and what is that?
Yeah, so the newsletter, I've actually got I think the piece you read, I've got a diagram actually, just in case. So yeah, for us, the newsletter is not a primary monetization proposition. I think because although we produce original analysis on those stories, we're not producing original content, and I don't know who would want to pay for a daily curated email in their inbox. People do great, but that's not our core aim at the moment. So for us, the newsletter is a bridge between people who might have heard of us and where we really want to get people, which is listening to the podcast. That's then where the value is for us, because we monetize our podcast through, we do special conversations episodes, which are like sponsorship. So they're standalone episodes, but sponsors can sort of talk about their solutions and the wider industry trends in a more informative way. And to get them to be successful, we need listeners, and we want listeners because listeners are great. And the newsletter is then a way of saying, right, to get somebody to listen straight out when they've not heard of you is a huge hurdle.
Right.
So the newsletter is then just, if you're enjoying our analysis, if you're enjoying our perspective on this, here's the daily reminder about the podcast. You might actually enjoy the podcast. And we found that the daily newsletter has had an impact where people have been like, oh, actually, yeah, do you know what? I will give the podcast a listen, and then that brings them into that ecosystem. So it's much more of a bridge for us, rather than a direct monetization opportunity in itself.
Right. So it's media analysis used as a content marketing strategy.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, when we've got tens of thousands of subscribers, we'd potentially look at monetizing the newsletter, but it's not a proper. It's not a priority.
Right. You're building a future way to make money, but it is aiding your current way of making money. Publisher that you worked with on the Media Moments 2020, and I wanted to understand, like, is that a partnership with What's New in Publishing, or what is the relationship between your company and that company?
I freelance for them.
Aha.
I've worked with the What's New in Publishing team for a number of years, and we actually wrote, back in 2018, we wrote an annual report for them because the three of us are writers, and we said, well, should we do this for them? So that was a partnership that we've continued, and it's in its third year now. So they've got they've got a much bigger audience than us for their content. That they primarily write articles, and we don't have the resources between the three of us to really compete with that. So we say, well, you've got the audience and the reach through your articles. They republish some of our podcast episodes as content. So it works out quite nicely because they've got a big audience of people that we want to reach, and we provide a type of content that they don't have the resources
it's very
to
like
return.
symbiotic. in nature.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. So has this process kind of grown your client audience in terms of your freelance work?
Yes, it's the podcast itself. I'm just wondering if you want me to stop screen sharing at some point.
Well, that's very nice to look at, though. I like the way that you've got...
Yeah.
It is completely fine to screen share, or if you want to pop us back over to your newsletter itself, I'm cool with it. We're going to have links. I do like my special pointy thing. We're going to have links so everyone can go see some of these things. But I highly recommend if you're publishing a newsletter and you want a great example of what a daily might look like for you, because I think that people are intimidated, right? That they have been putting like 10 to 15 pieces of content in their weekly curated newsletter. And if you say, why don't you go daily? Like the immediate response is, but that's a lot. Like, right?
Yeah, it is. And actually, I mean, we have to fight ourselves to keep our newsletter short. Because I mean, the three of us are writers. You can't shut us up when we get a keyboard. And it's the most common piece of feedback whenever we send a test out to each other. It's like, yeah, that's too long. You know, you need to cut it down. It's too long. But I think that's, for us, that's just where the value is. The value is that we've looked through everybody else's long newsletters. We've waded through them. We've pulled out we've done the hard work in pulling out what we think is important, and we just need to explain why and just keep it short. We could easily do a daily with loads and loads of content, but it's just, that's not what our audience needs or wants.
So I think what's interesting is that when someone imagines leaping from weekly to daily, they like imagine it as a solo thing, but you already were a team. How would you advise people who are considering increasing their send rate in terms of like building out a team? I know that to me, it seems like obvious, like have one person be in charge of one day, but I think you could also switch that and say like, you're in charge of one piece of content every day. So there's like a lot of things at play there. What advice would you give to people as they're sitting there doing what you did, establishing that new workflow?
Yeah, I would say you need to look for efficiencies wherever possible, whether that's in how you collect content, how you write content. The approvals process is something actually a lot of companies end up hitting a barrier on when they'll say, okay, you know, well, we send a newsletter once a week and it needs to go through 4 different sets of approval. And at that point, like that's not going to fit into a daily workflow. So you do need, you need somebody, I'd say, in charge of that. I mean, for us, I want to say we're fairly democratic as a 3. So you know, in that sense, it's not just one person in charge of it. We do very much split it equally between the 3 of us. But yeah, I think just one of the, if people are looking at launching a daily newsletter, the key thing is, or changing up their schedule, it's why and what are you doing it for? And nobody is ever sitting there saying, I really want more newsletters. So you have to be clear on why should somebody sign up to this, what are you bringing to their inbox every day. And I think especially one of the things I've seen a lot with a lot of the Substack writers that have launched is that they're putting these pieces that are absolutely enormous in people's, they're almost sending like an essay a day. And I remember Simon Owens was talking about it, and he said actually he got to the stage where sending more of those wasn't getting him any more subscribers. He found that if he sent, you know, maybe I think he ended up doing like 1 or 2 a week, and he said, I want to increase it to 3, and that didn't do anything. People actually started dropping off because they were like, I've just not got time.
Right.
There's still value in if you're doing a really long newsletter, it doesn't have to be a daily one, and you don't have to spend loads of time getting this daily newsletter sorted. That sounds quite contradictory when we're talking about daily newsletters.
I think you make a good point, though. I think like maybe daily is best suited to snippet type content. And twice a week could potentially be for 2 medium sized things. Once a week could be, you're extremely long. And so it really matters what your goal is with open rates and readership. Are you trying to...
It's a bit like newspapers, right? Like
Yeah.
a daily newspaper is a fairly thin thing that you kind of flick through in the morning. You might go to your relevant section. And the weekend newspapers are then the chunky, hefty ones that you spend a lot more time with. And it's just saying to people, you know, if it's taking you 3 hours to write a long daily newsletter and it's going to take somebody 40 minutes to read it, that's too much every day.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about, we can stop the screen share. I want to kind of circle back to this idea of subscriptions doing well in 2020. I'm reading some conflicting things about people who think that's going to go away. And then just a lot of content about the newsletter cycles that we get into, which is really almost just like a microcosm of the media cycles we get into, with independent publishers breaking away, then being successful, and then forming bundles, and then being a media group again. Like, so we go through these historical, you know, penny paper type cycles. And I'd love your perspective on inbox overload and content. I know we have some new products that have been launched lately that's like Listery is trying to take all of the newsletters and give you a digest of the content that was curated from those newsletters. Yeah. So we're just going to keep curating, right? But like, you know, what is your take on content overload and finding as a publisher what you want to put out, and then as a reader what you want to like allow yourself to subscribe to?
I'm always cautious about this because I'm aware it's probably quite a niche problem. Mm-hmm. It's a problem that people who read a lot of content think everybody else has a problem with. And I think it's so easy to think, oh yeah, you know, everybody's getting too much, like everybody's paying for all these Substacks and there's too much in their inbox and all this sort of thing. And actually, I think most normal people have a lot less going on in their inbox. I mean, certainly none of my family have ever subscribed to a personal newsletter and they never would. So I'm a little bit cautious about that. And I think that so many of those also play in quite narrow verticals where, you know, if I was to look at subscribing to a paid newsletter, whether that was personal or from a company, there's quite a narrow range that I could sign up to. Mm-hmm. And I think it's still too early for a lot of the, you know, a lot of the wider culture ones or ones that have got a wider subject area to really start taking off.
Do you think there's like a disconnect between what publishers think people want, especially like as they try to productize journalism, and what people actually do want?
Yeah, I think there's probably been a disconnect for the last 20 years.
I love it.
Yeah. And again, part of me wonders if this trend towards single writers is people just saying, actually, you know, there's too much going on. I don't want to subscribe to a publisher because there's all this content coming. I just want to subscribe to this little bit I'm interested in. Mm-hmm. But I mean, this is the bundle, unbundle, bundle, unbundle mm-hmm. argument coming back, and we see it. You know, we've seen it with film and TV and video. People sort of subscribe to, you know, I'm only interested in sport, and then actually it goes the other way and they're then happy to pay for a package with stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe the thing we could say is that content consumption behavior will never be static. It will always be changing, especially with new technology and like innovators coming up with new ways to deliver content in different forms.
Yeah, and I don't think you'll ever get to the stage where you've got everybody subscribing to verticals or everybody subscribing to bundles. Like it mm-hmm. will be, you'll have a segment of people that prefer their niche media. You'll get a segment that actually prefer stuff all bundled up together. So yeah, I'm not particularly concerned that about subscription fatigue and people sort of sitting there saying, oh, I don't know what to spend my £5 a month on, because I think people are always going to have their things that they're interested in. It's this idea of 1,000 true fans.
Mm-hmm. Maybe the bigger issue we have to face as a society is like how we teach young children, young adults to consume news, like how to critique the credibility of what you are digesting.
Yeah. Well, actually, that is one of my concerns around this rise in personal newsletters, is that the editor has been removed. And so you get people subscribing to extreme voices because that's the person they want to hear from, and there's no editor, and there's no, when anybody can publish and anybody can build an audience, and that really concerns. I think like Alex Jones has been one example of that, where he's built this enormous audience on the basis of a lot of it is complete misinformation and falsehoods, and it's kind of undermining that editor role.
Right. So then you have like the social media echo chamber becomes the subscription inbox echo chamber.
Yeah. And that worries me a bit more.
Yeah, because then big politics and everyone will come into play, knowing that a particular voice has an audience that they want to persuade in a particular direction. Yeah. So
we've seen writers leave fairly prominent publications recently because those publications have tried to modify their views, and they've said, oh no, actually I don't want to be censored anymore, and they'll then go and start up their own thing and their own audience. And it's like, well, sometimes that censorship is like obviously it's not censorship, but that moderation and that idea that actually if you subscribe to a publisher, you've got a range of views in this bundle is which this has got really deep and really depressing.
No, but you know what? I think this is wonderful for because our audience is newsletter creators. And a lot of times I have people who are considering either the next phase of their newsletter or the launch of their newsletter and their particular why. And I love for this dialogue to be going on in the minds of people who know that what they publish has the ability to influence.
Yeah. And I think I don't think there's certainly no if you've got a good proposition, you will find an audience for it. I don't think there's any. I've certainly got no concerns that people are sort of sitting there saying, oh, I'd really like to subscribe to this newsletter, but I get so many newsletters. Like if you've got a good newsletter and you've got people who want to get it and you've got a clear proposition for who those people are, you will find an audience. If you just want to write about baking, that's quite wide and it's quite broad, and you might start to hit that kind of barrier. But if you're talking about I'm going to round up the best vegan recipes each week, that's then a lot more specific, and at that point you're going to find an audience. And it's the same for us. Like we're very clear, we are targeting mid to senior level media professionals who don't have the time to read 15 stories in their inbox. That's not a large group, and at some point we will hit a ceiling where we've got a good number of those people, but because we know that that's our audience and we know that that's who we're targeting, we've got that proposition and people subscribe to it.
Okay, so then this triggers a conversation about traditional publishers like newspaper, magazine, etc., who have gone through like the painful or are in the middle of the painful transition to digital and have kind of had to compete with new media that just started digital. And the power of newsletter subscriptions to drive paid content subscriptions. Have you thought much about that strategy? And you're on the pulse of that. So what are you seeing working well for people in those positions?
Yeah, I mean, certainly after this year, you're either digital or you're not now.
True.
I actually think a lot of certainly this year, because of the COVID situation, I've actually seen a lot of the innovation come from the legacy publishers, especially when it comes to newsletters. I'm thinking, that there were publishers like the Washington Post and New York Times that suddenly launched entire newsletter verticals dedicated to coronavirus coverage. And they said, actually, we'll make these free and we'll make our coverage free, and we'll then try and lure you into the subscription cycle that way. The Atlantic's got a climate change vertical, and it's this idea that you can, it's
content marketing. Like it's a taste of something that then prompts you to pay for other
dividends. I mean, if you look at all their subscription numbers, their digital subscriptions are through the roof, like all of these publications this year. And a lot of them credit that to their newsletter strategy. And it's just the idea that actually you might not want to get the Washington Post's political coverage and traffic reports and whatever else. If you just want to get their coronavirus coverage, you can just get that in an email in your inbox every morning and sorted. I think Axios is actually one of my favorite for this, with their verticals. Like they are so well set up. I get their Tuesday media analysis newsletter, and that's just very much like, we're just bringing you what you need to know. We know you're not interested in US election coverage, because I really am not. So instead, we're just going to bring you the media news, and you can sign up to this newsletter. I think they've got 49 different verticals now. And that is very, very smart. And this year that has really, really accelerated. And that's really, really good to see.
And their why it matters is just like spot on. Like you can scan to why it matters. Like you can read a headline, scan to why it matters, and know whether you want to go deeper into that story.
Exactly. And they now make 50% of their revenue from newsletter sponsorship. They've got some really,
and they're
really
launching new
ones.
products. They're like getting into the software business. One newsletter I'm going to recommend to you is a lady I interviewed, I don't know, like a month or two ago. And the newsletter is called Below the Fold. And I think you might find it interesting if you haven't seen it yet, because what their team is doing is attempting to include, like, it's a twice a week newsletter with 3 stories that are not getting coverage. Like they're not making the front page type coverage, but they actually matter. And that audience is growing. And what's interesting is it was originally a content marketing play for their SaaS startup called Accio, which is like a Chrome extension that gives you historical context of any headline. So if you're like on the New York Times and you have Accio and you go into a story about diabetes, then it's going to give you like a timeline on the side that says like what. And so great like tool for journalists, but I think for Media Roundup or like conversations around media, that Anum there, or no, it's Anum. I'm horrible with names. This is why I'm not saying Kazia or Kazaya. Kazaya? Yes. Okay. But super interesting tool that you guys might have some interest in. I'm trying to think of any other questions that you feel like, or any other advice you might want to give to people who are in media, considering their own newsletter, considering just launching something editorial. What would be the thing you would tell them, like the homework you would give them to do?
I would actually say quite early on, you need to decide what response is important to you, because so many people talk about numbers and you've got to get tens of thousands of subscribers. And it's like, well, you can get email addresses anyway. You can pick up email addresses cheaply, easily. But so for us, our big focus is engagement. It's are the people that are signing up to our newsletter actually opening it? And are they actually clicking on stuff? And sometimes, we're not so bothered about whether they're clicking on stuff, because we try and do a good job of summarizing their stories. But is it of interest to them? Is it useful to them? And so, although it's very, I like to look at the subscriber numbers going up, and I like to look at who opens and unsubscribes. But at the same time, like, that's not our core metric. Our core metric is, are more people engaged this month than they were last month? What stories do they click on? What is helpful to them? What is useful to them? And so every newsletter we go into and we say, right, who clicked on what? Not that sounds really creepy.
No, I get what you're saying, that like, which of these links have the most engagement? One thing we do is with Opt-in Weekly, I have like different categories. And so I'll have my newsletter tips and then my publishing news. And so like a lot of things from Media Roundup, I'll do like via Media Roundup. If you guys had a story in there that I think my audience would like as well. And then like I have a screen share, which we are recording right now, and that always gets the most clicks. But I can get a report that gives me which categories are performing best. And so I feel like that's like a throwback to the old school, magazine editor background that I had, where you like had a front of book, a middle of, and back of book, and you knew what to put in the feature well because people had given feedback, or so in this case it's like I can see, okay, people really like the video link, and people second most popular is probably newsletter tips, and so you can actually reorder. And so I love that you guys have that podcast repeated in every issue, because you're right, it catches me on Monday and I'm like, I do want to listen to that, but I don't have time. And we all know that if we click on something and open the tab, that does not guarantee that we are going to finish it by the end of the day. So
but actually there's a flip side to that as well, which we've almost fallen into the trap of a few times, where we've been like, so I think one article we shared was it was actually on practical tips to drive newsletter engagement, and that got loads and loads of clicks, and we thought, oh, does this mean we need to put more practical content in? And now we try a couple of times a week just to put something in about how people can actually make a difference to their jobs, or tips for product people in publishing, that sort of thing. But at the same time, we can't then make the newsletter all about that, because people will read our top story and read our analysis and not click on it because we've just summed it up, and they don't need to. And we have people emailing us and telling us that. So that's then it's quite difficult. Just because the story hasn't been clicked on doesn't mean that it's not of interest.
Exactly. So then you get into scroll depth, or you get into I think of it as one of the unmeasurable measurables, which is just they respond
gut, right?
Or do they send a response back and they say hey, thanks for covering this, or I strongly disagree with your take on.
Sometimes it's actually we don't agree with your take on that, and that's absolutely fine as well. And actually I think that's another point, is that when people do respond to our issues, we always write back and just say, thanks, we've either we don't agree with you, or
your opinion matters, and I'm glad we're in a conversation. So then, do you think that there is some value to, I know you want them to know who edited this issue. Do you think there's some value to, with a newsletter like yours, people kind of having an idea of who the people are behind it?
I think that actually ties in more to the podcast, because the podcast is so driven by the three of our personalities, and we do have very distinct stances on things in the podcast. So I'm really sort of into platforms and all the legislation around that, and Peter's really kind of passionate about print and magazines, and Chris is very big on politics and trust, and I think and again, this is possibly one of the things, if you come to the podcast via the newsletter, you've already got a little bit of an idea about who's who. And if you then read the newsletter and you're already a podcast listener, you already know what that kind of angle is going to be that morning. So if it's if it's more kind of stories about British politics and the papers and the sorts of things that go on there, it's not less likely to come from me.
Right. I love that.
And I think that just helps
that's like beat reporting 101. You take this, you take it, and it's so much better when it aligns with your passion or your expertise. So I think we have talked through quite a few things. I am so excited that you joined us today. Everybody go check out Media Roundup and Media Voices, the podcast. Podcasts to me are like the new thing you listen to as you do another thing. They've been very comforting during COVID to just have a voice in your ear talking about something that you're interested in. So if you are like a media geek like me, that would be a great podcast for you to go check out. And then we'll also have the Media Moments link as well. I think this one's going to air in early 2021. I'm going to take a few weeks break. So anyone who's gotten this far, this was recorded before the Christmas holiday, but will be airing after. And we encourage people to ask questions in the comments of the YouTube video. So I will ping you if someone asks a question that we think that you would want to respond to and answer, and we'll try to get a little conversation going there as well.
Definitely. Well, thank you very much for having me. I feel like
Thanks for
there's so much more you could talk about, but
I know.